There is a moment in 41 BC that ancient historians described with a kind of breathless awe they rarely applied to anyone. Mark Antony had summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus, a city on the southern coast of what is now Turkey, to answer questions about her loyalties during the recent Roman Civil War. He sent the summons the way powerful men send summons, with the assumption that she would come quickly, come humbly, and come prepared to explain herself. She did not come quickly, she made him wait. And when she finally arrived, she did not arrive as a queen answering a summons. She arrived as a goddess granting an audience. Her barge appeared on the river Cydnus moving toward the city, and the ancient historian Plutarch, writing more than a century later, still could not describe it in ordinary language. The vessel itself was covered in gold. Its purple sails were so richly dyed that they seemed to absorb and re-emit the light of the afternoon sun. The oars were silver, and they moved in rhythm to the sound of flutes and harps and pipes playing across the water. The deck was crowded with young women dressed as sea nymphs and cupids, some handling the sails, some standing at the sides with fans so large that when they moved them in unison, the air around the barge itself seemed to shimmer. And over all of it, drifting outward across both river banks and into the city streets, rolled clouds of Kifi incense. Kifi was not perfume in any ordinary sense. It was a sacred compound burned exclusively in the temples of the Egyptian gods. It was the smell of the divine. The people of Tarsus lined every bank of the river to watch. Then they flooded into the streets to follow the smell toward the water. And Plutarch records that by the time the barge docked, the marketplace of Tarsus was completely empty. Antony was left sitting on his tribunal in the public square, alone, surrounded by abandoned stalls and empty benches, waiting for crowds that had gone to see a goddess arrive. She had emptied a Roman city of its population before she stepped off the boat. That is the moment you need to sit with, because everything that followed between Cleopatra and Mark Antony, the alliance, the children, the war against Octavian, the final catastrophe at Actium, everything flowed from the power dynamic established in that single engineered afternoon. She was not answering his summons, she was receiving him, and he understood it. Every person watching understood it, but what almost no one talks about is how deliberately and systematically that moment was constructed. The Kaifi was not burned because Cleopatra liked the smell. Kaifi was a compound so complex to produce that its recipe was carved into the walls of Egyptian temples, locked behind priestly knowledge and unavailable to ordinary commerce. Using it in a public spectacle meant importing the sacred rites of the Egyptian gods into a Greek city under Roman authority. It meant making the air of that city smell like the presence of a deity. It was a theological statement made through chemistry. The purple sails were not chosen because purple was pretty. Purple was the single most expensive dye in the ancient world, produced from tens of thousands of sea snails to generate a small quantity of pigment. It was the color of supreme authority, royal legitimacy, and divine favor in every Mediterranean culture that mattered. Sailing into Tarsus under purple meant arriving under a flag that every person watching could read instantly, regardless of language or culture. The music was not entertainment, it was pacing, it was control of time. In ancient ceremonial contexts, music was understood to accompany the presence of the gods. The combination of sound, scent, color, and spectacle that Cleopatra staged on the Cydnus was not a seduction, it was a religious event. She was not presenting herself as a powerful woman who was also charming. She was presenting herself as the goddess Isis made flesh, arriving in mortal form to meet the man Rome called the new Dionysus. And that framing mattered enormously for everything that followed. Because if Cleopatra was Isis and Antony was Dionysus, their alliance was not a political arrangement between two powerful figures. It was the union of two divine forces, a cosmological partnership that carried its own kind of legitimacy, its own kind of authority, its own kind of claim on the loyalty of everyone who believed the world was shaped by the will of the gods. In Egypt, that framing was received as exactly what it claimed to be. Cleopatra had spent years cultivating her identification with Isis, the goddess of wisdom, magic, motherhood, and the throne itself. She appeared in temple reliefs as Isis. She wore the symbolic headdress of Isis in public ceremonies. She allowed and encouraged her subjects to approach her not merely as a queen, but as the living embodiment of the goddess who had brought order out of chaos and raised the dead back to life. Her son with Caesar, Caesarion, was presented to the Egyptian public as the child of a god and a goddess. When she presented herself on that barge at Tarsus, she was not improvising a theatrical gesture. She was exporting a fully developed theological identity to a foreign audience, translating it into a sensory vocabulary that required no explanation. The smell of the gods, the color of kings, the sound of divine presence moving across water. Antony was a Roman soldier. He had won battles across 3 continents. He had never encountered anything like that afternoon in Tarsus. He invited her to dinner that night. She declined. She invited him to dine on her barge instead. He came. The power dynamic of their entire subsequent relationship was set in that exchange. She did not chase Roman power, she made Roman power come to her. And she did it by understanding something that no military campaign, no treasury surplus, no political negotiation could have achieved on its own. She understood that the most durable form of power is not the kind that compels people through force. It is the kind that makes people believe at the level of sensation and instinct and awe that the person in front of them is simply larger than ordinary reality. Cleopatra did not make Antony fall in love with her on the Cydnus. She made him a believer, and believers are more useful than allies. They do not calculate the odds, they follow. If this version of Cleopatra is the one history owed you all along, drop a comment below and tell me what part of her strategy you find most extraordinary. And follow Cleopatra Unfiltered because the real story of the ancient world's greatest propagandist has barely begun to be told.